Right everyone, this is the first video linked to topic 10, which is looking at poverty and inequality in both developing and developed economies. What I want to cover in this video is how we go about measuring things like development and how we go about measuring things like inequality. So what we'll do is want to start by differentiating between economic growth and economic development. Now, economic growth is obviously something we looked at massively in AS economics. And if you think about it, there's two ways of thinking about this. You've got actual and you've got potential economic growth. Actual economic growth, all it is, it's about growth in real GDP. In other words, it's a growth in the output of the economy. Potential economic growth is measured by an increase in the productive capacity. Okay, so you can show this with AD, AS diagrams. So actual could be aggregate demand increasing, it could be the SRAS curve shifting to the right. Potential could be the LRAS curve shifting outwards. You can also look at this on a PPF, a production possibility frontier. So imagine you've got an economy that can produce either consumer or capital goods. Potential economic growth would be the PPF moving outwards. Actual could be, imagine you've got an economy that's producing CO1, CA1. It's moving out CO2, CA2. So all that basically shows that the economy is using more of its resources to produce a big level of output than what they were before. So actual, it's an increase in output. Potential, it's an increase in the productive capacity. In other words, there's more or better resources available within the economy. Now, economic development is different. Development is about living standards. Now, this is a much more complex thing to try and measure because ultimately, living standards is made up of lots and lots of different variables. So for me, my living standards will be dictated to, well, I suppose in simple terms, it's by how many wants and needs you can satisfy. So we're looking here at access to food, drinking water, for example. Incomes are obviously important, housing, infrastructure, education, healthcare, crime, how happy people are. So it's made up of lots and lots of different things. Now, people often think that economic growth goes hand in hand with development. So in other words, people think that when economies grow, there should be a growth in living standards. Now, broadly, that's true. Think about why. If you've got more economic growth, it tends to be an unemployment force. There are more jobs available. More jobs will mean that wages start to grow. People can access a bigger range of goods and services, better housing, better infrastructure, better food, better clothing. But on top of that, more people working, growth, more people paying taxes. There should be more funds available to provide people with things like better healthcare, better education, better opportunities. So growth should lead to more development, but the problem is that growth can also mean more pollution, less sustainability, more congestion on the roads, more negative externalities, and these things can lower living standards. It's also possible that growth might only benefit the more wealthy in the economy, so it could simply just line the pockets of the rich and have no real benefits for the poor people. So we often say that for growth to be able to support development, it's got to be pro-poor. It's not just benefit the people at the top of the pile, but benefit those lower down as well. Right, let's think now about how you would measure something like development in a country. Now, there are lots and lots of different ways of doing this. We often start off with something like real GDP per capita. PPP, purchasing power parity. This basically shows the ability to buy goods and services within an economy. Okay, so it should act as an indicator of development because you'd associate a higher average wage in an economy to lead to better access to wants and needs, good service to satisfy wants and needs. So again, housing, healthcare, education, transport, infrastructure, food, all these different things. The problems you've got when it comes to using real GDP per capita, though, is that in many economies across the world, especially poorer ones, you've got a large informal economy or informal sector. Now we're looking here at GDP or output that's not officially been measured or recorded. Okay, so many developing economies across the world where people traditionally are, let's say subsistence farmers, they field or farm their own land. The output they produce is not sold. It's simply used to feed themselves, maybe do some kind of bartering, for example. But because a lot of this output is not measured or recorded in any kind of official way, it will not form part of national income statistics. And it's not just agriculture work, it could be, in many poor countries, you've got a lot of people that are involved in, well, I suppose it could be things like recycling work, where people literally scour the streets for recyclable waste. It could be horrible things like prostitution, but they're all things that generate an income that would not show up in national income statistics. Another big problem when it comes to measuring development through real GDP per capita is that you've got inequality. Okay, an economy with high inequality, for example, would make a real average wage almost irrelevant. It holds no resemblance to what's happening for the lives of many people on the streets. Further to that, you've got regional differences. So even in a country like Britain, an average wage for a country doesn't always show what's happening in poor regions across the economy. So the north of England, for example, with lots of deindustrialisation, the average wage will be lower than what it would be for the average for the economy. Other problems when it comes to real GDP per capita, there are lots of variables that have been excluded. You could argue you've got things like, well, what's access to healthcare like in the country, education, transport, what are crime rates like, how happy are people? They're all things that many people would say that, well, in some way, that they could be measured through real GDP per capita, but on the whole, it's not fantastic. So what we often use instead is the Human Development Index, so the HDI. It's worth pointing out there is also something called the HDI, which will try to include a measurement for inequality in an economy as well. Now on this index, every country will get a score from 0 to 1. 0 would show no development, 1 would show full development. And how it works out, this score, it gives every country a ranking in 3 different areas. And we have education. These are measured through adult literacy rates, but also things like average years of schooling. You've got life expectancy, and what I'm hoping you're realising is that will tell us a lot about a country. One with a high life expectancy should have good access to food and clean drinking water, keeping people safe, inoculating people from things like measles, for example. Children born in childbirth survive, for example, because of good healthcare. There's things to look after people when they get old, for example. So it underpins lots of things which can be used to measure development in a country. And what we also do, we factor in incomes. Again, it's PPP. Okay, now this is seen as a much more favourable way of measuring development because it factors in so much more. Okay, so the most developed nation on the planet at the moment, I think, is Norway, score of about 0.94. The UK is in the top 20, a highly developed economy. So on this measure, to be a highly developed economy, you've got to have good education standards, you've got to have a high life expectancy and a high real income. Again, it's not perfect. It's not this all-encompassing, wonderful measurement of development, because development's made up of all sorts of different things. but it's certainly much better than what real GDP per capita is. Right, now the next thing we need to be looking at measuring is inequality. Remember, all inequality does, it measures the gap between the rich and the poor within the economy. And we can measure it through income inequality, or we can measure it through wealth. So income is a flow of earnings, so for most people this would be their job, their employment, but it could also be, so let's write these down. So job, it could be dividends, so returns on shares. It could even factor in benefits if you wanted to. It could be pensions. It could even be rent on property that people earn. Wealth is a store of assets. Okay, so these can be generated income. So for example, for many people their main wealth is their house. If you own a second home, you might rent it out, for example. You might have savings in the bank that generate an interest. So interest can also be an income. It could be you own stocks and shares, which will give you dividends or hopefully on an annual basis. Now, what we can do to measure inequality, we can draw something called a Lorenz curve. Now, what a Lorenz curve will have is axes like this. So on the bottom axis, we're going to have percent of households. So we're going from 0 to 100. Then on this axis, we have percent of the income. And again, that's 0 up to 100. And all I do, this vertical axis we have on both sides, percent of income. And again, it's 0 up to 100%. Now what we start off with is this. This is our line of full equality. Now the idea would be on this line, everyone earns the same wage within the economy. There would be no inequality, no gap between rich and poor. So the idea would be on the horizontal axis, we've got the percent of households. And these are in rank order from the poorest, down here, up to the richest households. Okay, so on this line, we have full equality. Then what we can add is a Lorenz curve. So the blue line is our Lorenz curve. Okay, now if you were interpreting this, what you could do, if I just pick up blue, well, let's go for the black pen. If I was to go for this point here, for example, off the line of full equality, you know, roughly what this shows is that 45% of the households in the country make up 45% of the income. If I go for my Lorenz curve, it shows, well, actually, about 45% of the households maybe earn only 10% of the income. Okay, now what you can then do, you can play around with these Lorenz curves. So if I was to draw, let's draw two axes. So remember, you've got percent of households and you've got percent of income, and that's the same on both of these, but I'll not put it down on both. We have our line of full equality, and then you can add a Lorenz curve. So what I could do, I could show one with low levels of inequality, okay, and then I could show one with high levels of inequality. So hopefully what you've realised there is the further we move away from the line of full equality, the higher the inequality will be in the economy. And what we then get from this, we get these two different areas, A and B. And then what we can use this for is to calculate the Gini coefficient. Now on this, every country will get a score from 0 to 1. Okay, now if we had a score of 0, it would show full equality. If we get a score of 1, it would show full inequality, where the income is owned by one person, if you like. Now to work this out, the formula, not that you would need to calculate this in the exam, would be A divided by A plus B. Okay, so what I would say is the bigger A is, the bigger the inequality will be. The smaller A is, the less inequality they will be. Okay, so the UK in recent years has become a more unequal society. The Gini coefficient is increasing. And this is a problem that we experience in many economies across the world. Okay, now what we'll do in the next lesson, the next video, is talk about the causes of inequality.